What happens when a trade war bluff gets called and the other side strikes back even harder? As Donald Trump's reckless tariff threats escalate, Canada's auto industry is no longer staying silent. In a stunning turn of events, Canadian manufacturers, backed by bold leadership, are now hitting back with precision, and the consequences for Trump's economic gamble are explosive. Could this be the moment his tariff strategy collapses under its own weight? Join us as we break down how Canada turned the tables, why Trump's plan is unraveling, and what it means for the future of North American trade and diplomacy. A crippling blow to North America's auto heartland. It began quietly, but decisively. On March 1st, 2025, former U.S. President Donald Trump announced a 25% tariff on all Canadian automobile exports entering the United States, Canada's most vital export category. The announcement was couched in aggressive rhetoric: protection of American jobs, punishment for unfair trade deals, and retaliation against Canada's environmental mandates and tax policies. Yet what it ignited was a firestorm of economic dislocation, supply chain breakdowns, and cross-border political tension that now threatens to redefine the Canada-US relationship. Canada, long considered the most integrated automotive partner in the United States manufacturing base, was caught in the blast zone. With roughly 85% of Canadian vehicle production historically destined for U.S. markets, and supply chains built on just-in-time logistics and complex multi-border part transfers, the shockwaves were immediate. Many parts and sub-assemblies crossed the border 5, 6, even 7 times before the final car or truck was assembled in Ontario or Michigan. The tariff didn't just tax Canadian cars. It shattered the tempo of a synchronized industrial ballet that had evolved over decades. Windsor at a standstill, Canada's auto capital buckles nowhere, were the consequences more visible than in Windsor, Ontario, often called the Detroit of Canada. The city sits just across the river from its U.S. counterpart and houses critical assembly and tooling operations for automakers like Stellantis Ford Canada and General Motors Canada. Within weeks of Trump's tariff decree, tool and die shops began reporting canceled orders. Automakers hit pause on retooling programs, delaying new vehicle models. Then came the layoffs. By June 2025, some facilities had reduced their workforce by 40 to 50%, cutting deeply into a middle-class job base that had been the region's economic backbone. Parking lots, once filled with shift workers, now sat half-empty. Suppliers struggled to stay afloat as assembly lines slowed. Local officials warned that the cascading job losses could turn a temporary disruption into a full-blown economic crisis. Truckers who carried parts between Ontario and Michigan reported a drastic drop in volume. Over 70% of Canada-US trade is moved by truck, and the disruption to that flow revealed just how much both economies depended on frictionless border cooperation. Where once there had been constant motion, there was now congestion, confusion, and cancellations. Warehouse operators saw inventory piling up on the Canadian side with nowhere to send it. A president's obsession, targeting Canada's auto sector. Observers on both sides of the border questioned why Trump had gone after Canadian autos so aggressively. His administration offered little in the way of formal justification beyond vague grievances about job theft and carbon compliance manipulation. But critics saw a more ideological motive. Trump's trade team, including hawkish former officials reappointed to temporary roles in 2025, had identified Canada's zero-emission vehicle, ZEV, mandate as an economic vulnerability. That became the wedge. Under Canada's ZEV law, which took effect in Q1 of 2025, at least 20% of all new passenger vehicles sold in Canada in 2026 must be electric or hybrid models. As of early 2025, that number was just 8%. Automakers warned Ottawa that the target was both unrealistic and financially punitive. Failing to meet it would cost manufacturers up to 20,000 Canadian dollars per vehicle, whether in carbon credits or required infrastructure investments, such as charging stations. By framing this domestic policy as a trade barrier, Trump positioned himself as standing up for U.S. manufacturers against green energy extremism and used it as a pretext to launch his tariff regime. But for Canadians, the measure was viewed as unprovoked economic sabotage, an attack not only on the auto industry, but on national sovereignty. A prime minister under pressure, Carney responds. Facing an economic onslaught and political backlash, Prime Minister Mark Carney convened a closed-door emergency summit in early July, with top leaders from Canada's major auto manufacturers and the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, CVMA. Held in Ottawa under strict media blackout, the meeting was a turning point. Executives from Ford Canada, Stellantis, and GM Canada laid out a series of dire projections. Without immediate intervention or relief, more assembly plants could go idle within months. Investments in EV transition strategies were now frozen, pending clarity on the regulatory and trade landscape. The automakers didn't just want subsidies, they wanted diplomatic action and, perhaps, retaliation. Carney, known globally for his cool-headed economic stewardship and central banking acumen, did not flinch. But he also did not escalate. Instead, he signaled a strategy of flexibility, not surrender. He floated short-term regulatory concessions, allowing for temporary waivers or adjustment mechanisms on the EV mandate. More importantly, he expanded Canada's broader trade pivot, a strategy to reduce U.S. dependency and deepen ties with other global partners. Trade realignment. Canada looks. Beyond the U.S., Canada's vulnerability in 2025 had less to do with trade imbalances and more to do with over-reliance. For decades, the U.S. had been Canada's largest trading partner, absorbing more than $450 billion in exports annually. Carney's strategy was to diversify, and fast. By mid-2025, Canada accelerated trade negotiations with the European Union and key Indo-Pacific nations, including Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. Drawing inspiration from Australia's ability to withstand Chinese economic coercion by diversifying trade, Canada began dismantling interprovincial trade barriers, creating a more cohesive domestic market to improve competitiveness and reduce costs. Carney emphasized that this wasn't about retreating from global trade. It was about repositioning Canada's economic posture to be less vulnerable to U.S. whims. Countdown to conflict. July 9th and July 21st. Trump, for his part, set July 9th as a hard deadline. If Canada failed to make substantial concessions, including changes to its EV policy and digital services tax, more tariffs would be triggered, potentially targeting sectors like pharmaceuticals, dairy, or tech services. But Carney drew his own line in the sand. July 21st. That's the deadline he gave for a new bilateral agreement, one based on fairness and mutual respect. If no deal materializes, Carney's government is prepared to reintroduce retaliatory tariffs on over $125 billion worth of American goods. These would cover everything from agriculture and machinery to software, consumer electronics, and alcohol. Public support for retaliation is growing. The Buy Canadian movement is gaining steam, with Canadians turning away from U.S. brands, products, and destinations. It's not just politics. It's economic nationalism born from frustration, pride, and a belief that Canada deserves better. Silent sanctions, the invisible retaliation of consumers. While politicians haggle and diplomats meet behind closed doors, ordinary Canadians are already responding. quietly but powerfully. The impact is now visible across the United States, particularly in regions that had once relied heavily on Canadian tourism and commerce. In Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, and Maine, hospitality and tourism officials report devastating declines in cross-border travel. According to Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey, Canadian tourism is down between 20 and 60% compared to 2024 levels. School trips from Quebec and Ontario were cancelled, airline bookings plummeted, and businesses in tourist-heavy districts like Boston's North End and Burlington's waterfront are seeing real revenue drops. Retailers, restaurants, and hotels aren't the only ones hurting. Regional airlines serving Boston Logan and JFK have reduced flights. Tourism agencies are pulling ads from Canadian markets, realizing their marketing budgets are no match for the power of resentment. Even Florida, long a magnet for Canadian snowbirds, is reporting a collapse in short-term property rentals and a spike in resale listings of vacation homes. Wine, tariffs, and economic spillover. The damage isn't limited to people and planes. It's also visible in something as unexpected as wine exports. In April 2025, U.S. wine exports to Canada dropped by a staggering 93% year-over-year. The American Association of Wine Economists called it unprecedented. Canada, once accounting for over a third of U.S. wine exports by value, has effectively disappeared from the market. This wasn't a formal tariff. It was a consumer revolt. Wine distributors in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario reported mass cancellations of U.S. wine shipments. Restaurants delisted U.S. labels from menus. Retailers replaced American bottles with imports from Europe, South Africa, or domestic Canadian vintages. The result? A glut in U.S. inventory. In California, where 93% of U.S. wine is produced, prices have fallen and storage costs are rising. Other agricultural products are beginning to feel the pressure. The trend of displaced U.S. goods and redirected Canadian consumption is creating ripple effects in distribution, warehousing, and cross-border logistics. Everyday consequences, heating bills, and grocery costs. The economic pain is not confined to exports and tourism. It's reaching into American households and businesses. A 2025 report by the Healey administration in Massachusetts estimated that increased tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel would cause a $2.5 billion rise in heating and construction costs across New England over the coming years. Small businesses in New York and Vermont are facing higher input costs for everything from restaurant supplies to medical equipment. With key materials now subject to tariffs or uncertain delivery timelines, many are reevaluating suppliers, trimming hours, or delaying investments. Health clinics, bakeries, and construction firms alike are being hit by cascading cost increases passed down the supply chain. Meanwhile, Canadian businesses are rerouting shipments, bypassing U.S. ports in favor of Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific alternatives. Rail and maritime routes to Europe and Asia are expanding as contingency plans become permanent features of a post-tariff economy. A defining moment in North American relations. What began as a targeted tariff policy has now evolved into a continental trade rupture, affecting sectors from autos and agriculture to tourism and tech. The mutual trust that underpinned NAFTA and its successor, CUSMA, is eroding under the weight of political weaponization of trade. July 9th will be the first inflection point, a test of whether Trump doubles down or backs off. But July 21st will be the true reckoning. Does Carney retreat or retaliate? Either outcome could reshape North America's economic landscape for years to come. This isn't just a dispute about steel, cars, or wine. It's about power, resilience, and the future of democratic trade diplomacy. It's about whether Canada can weather a storm unleashed by its closest ally. and emerge not just intact, but stronger. A deadline draws near. Canada's calculated warning, Prime Minister Mark Carney is not one to speak in absolutes, but in this case, his message could not have been clearer. With a firm but measured tone, he announced that if the United States does not reach a trade deal with Canada by July 21st, Ottawa will impose retaliatory tariffs on American steel and aluminum. This declaration, though devoid of theatrical flair, sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles across both sides of the border. Standing behind Carney was Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, voicing support for Canadian industries battered by months of economic turbulence. "We are determined to protect Canadian businesses," Kenney said, affirming that Canada is willing to sign a security and economic agreement, but only one that serves the country's national interest. This was not a cry for unity under duress. It was a statement of sovereignty. Carney, a former central banker turned statesman, has approached the crisis with a blend of realism and restraint. For months, he has resisted pressure to escalate rhetorically, choosing instead to let economic consequences speak louder than political noise. The fallout of inaction. When silence costs, Canada's approach to Trump's tariff regime has been remarkable not for its loudness, but for its discipline. While Trump's administration has engaged in an increasingly aggressive economic campaign, Canada has not retaliated with media blitzes or diplomatic tantrums. It has simply stepped back and let the numbers do the talking. The results have been devastating. Tourism from the United States has plummeted, particularly in border towns that rely on American visitors. Wine exports to the U.S. have collapsed, leaving Canadian vintners with surplus stock and no market. In grocery aisles across Canada, the cost of imported American goods has spiked, squeezing middle-class households and exacerbating inflation. These aren't just statistics. They are daily realities now confronting Canadians. In the United States, the consequences are becoming harder to ignore. While Trump's tariff policy continues to stir debates in Washington, the real costs are surfacing in unexpected places. Unsold crates of California wine, rising prices on Canadian shelves, and American businesses losing reliable northern partners. A trade war once dismissed as a hypothetical exercise in brinkmanship is now a lived experience. The question that looms isn't just about economics, it's about who will blink first. A pivot in progress, from Washington to Brussels. As relations with the United States continued to deteriorate, Prime Minister Carney made a bold move. Canada, once tethered tightly to American economic gravity, is now actively rewriting its foreign alliances. In a significant step forward, Carney signed a strategic defense and security partnership with the European Union, a wide-ranging agreement that covers economic cooperation, digital trade, rare earth minerals, and joint defense strategies. This diplomatic milestone came just weeks after the G7 summit in Alberta, where Trump signed a bilateral trade deal with the United Kingdom but abruptly walked away from the Canadian negotiations, leaving Canada in limbo. That summit had been expected to be a breakthrough moment. Instead, it crystallized the growing divergence between Ottawa and Washington, and then came the NATO summit in The Hague. While Trump used the gathering to demand greater military spending from allies and double down on tariffs, Carney used the moment to cement new relationships. The result was not a confrontation, but a geostrategic pivot. For the first time in decades, Canada placed its long-term economic and defense bets outside the American orbit. It was a profound realignment, subtle in tone, but unmistakable in meaning. Strategic patience meets economic resolve. Trump has long been enamored with tariffs, calling them tools for economic justice. He has imposed them on allies and adversaries alike, from China to Mexico to the European Union. When Canada found itself in his crosshairs earlier this year, the White House branded the policy as liberation tariffs, aimed at correcting so-called trade imbalances and restoring national resilience. But in Canadian industrial towns like Hamilton, Ontario, or Sault Ste. Marie, where steel mills are lifelines and energy exports form the backbone of local economies, the effects have been crushing. The 25% tariff on Canadian steel and the 10% tariff on energy exports, imposed in early March, landed like a body blow to working families. By May 2025, over 59,000 manufacturing jobs had vanished, according to Statistics Canada. Some plants have scaled back production, others have shuttered entirely. For Carney, this isn't just macroeconomics, it's human fallout. A former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney understands capital flows and supply chains better than most. But he also understands that behind every lost job is a family in distress. That's why he set a clear red line. Remove the tariffs, or Canada will respond, not with slogans, but with countermeasures targeted at politically sensitive sectors. Washington's stubbornness and Canada's silent strength, Carney's diplomacy, has been defined by a singular strategy: pressure without escalation. Ottawa laid out its position plainly. Free trade must be fair, open, and reciprocal. But Washington has shown no willingness to budge. Trump's approach remains transactional. Tariffs work, he declared during a White House press event in June. Negotiations are only on my terms. This has placed Canada in a diplomatic quandary. On one hand, a trade deal with the U.S. remains essential. No other partner can match the scale of bilateral trade, nor the historical and logistical ease of cross-border commerce. On the other hand, relying on an unpredictable and punitive neighbor is no longer tenable. So, Carney moved quickly and decisively. The EU deal, a new chapter in Canadian sovereignty. Just days before the NATO summit, Carney landed in Brussels and signed a landmark agreement with the EU. It wasn't just about goods or tariffs, it was a blueprint for a new world order. The agreement includes joint defense procurement, AI and cybersecurity coordination, cooperation on critical minerals and rare earth elements, and a shared vision for digital infrastructure and climate innovation. One key pillar of the deal is industrial policy alignment. Canada and Europe have agreed to synchronize investment strategies in clean energy, semiconductors, and next-generation infrastructure. There's also a shared commitment to nuclear energy partnerships, expanded rail and port capacity, and a deepening of Arctic cooperation, areas where American involvement has been either inconsistent or conditional. More symbolically, Canada committed to meeting NATO's 2% GDP defense spending target, with plans to reach 5% over the next decade. That amounts to roughly 150 billion Canadian dollars per year, a staggering figure that includes investments in domestic resilience, infrastructure for critical mineral extraction, and naval modernization. German-built submarines and expanded joint naval exercises in the Atlantic are now on the table. A message to Washington: we're not waiting. Anymore, to the untrained eye, these announcements might seem like dry, technocratic news, but the optics are stunning. In Brussels, Carney stood alongside EU leaders and emphasized a shared commitment to open markets, democratic norms, and global stability. It was a quiet but unmistakable rebuke to Trump's isolationist agenda. Washington, for its part, has responded with strategic silence. The White House issued no formal statement on the Canada-EU partnership, but behind closed doors, officials are rattled. For decades, the U.S. has enjoyed a position of dominance in the North American economic system. Now, Canada is charting its own path, no longer assuming American cooperation as the default. Not a reaction, but a realignment. It's important to note, the Canada-EU agreement was not some hastily arranged retaliation. It had been months in the making, involving dozens of trade negotiators, defense attachés, and industrial policy experts. However, its timing was intentional. Just weeks before the July 21st trade deadline with the U.S., it sent a signal to Washington. Canada has options, and the will to pursue them. Even as Carney strengthened ties with Europe, Trump was doubling down on tariffs. No exemptions were offered, no olive branches extended, just more economic pressure and political chest-thumping. But Ottawa remained unmoved. For Canada, this wasn't about appeasement or retaliation. It was about reshaping the geopolitical map, one quiet but decisive deal at a time. The final countdown. With fewer than 30 days remaining before the deadline, the stakes could not be higher. If Trump refuses to lift tariffs, Canada's retaliatory measures will snap into place, targeting U.S. industries from agriculture to consumer electronics. Behind the scenes, Canadian officials are preparing a tiered response, aimed at both economic leverage and political visibility. American swing states with heavy manufacturing and agriculture exports to Canada are likely to feel the first wave. But even more than that, this moment will test the viability of Carney's doctrine of strategic patience. Can quiet diplomacy, calculated diversification, and firm deadlines achieve what chest-pounding and tariffs cannot? That question will be answered not in sound bites, but in port shipments, job numbers, and policy shifts. Conclusion: the quiet standoff between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney is not just a dispute over trade. It's a contest of worldviews. Nationalism versus multilateralism, coercion versus cooperation, bluster versus discipline. Canada's pivot toward Europe isn't just a diplomatic strategy. It's a declaration of independence, a refusal to be economically blackmailed by a volatile superpower. As the July 21st deadline approaches, the world watches. Not for the next speech or tweet, but for the next shipment delayed and the next job lost or saved. In the balance hangs not just a deal, but the future of North American trade. Canada is no longer asking for fairness. It is demanding it and preparing to act if it's denied.